Before you hear what I'm about to tell you, I need you to understand something first. I spent 34 years as an electrical engineer. I built systems, diagnosed failures, traced faults back to their source. I was the person companies called when something invisible was wrong, when the problem didn't announce itself, when the damage was already happening behind a wall no one had thought to open. I thought that made me sharp. I thought it made me hard to fool. What I learned at 63 is that the most dangerous circuits are the ones you never think to test because you trust the hand that wired them. So before you judge anyone in this story, ask yourself one honest question. When was the last time you checked the thing someone gave you out of love? My name is Marcus. I'm 63 years old and I live in a brick house on the east side of Decatur, Georgia, about 20 minutes from downtown Atlanta. The house needs a new roof, and the back porch has been leaning slightly since 2019, but I've been meaning to get to it. I retired 2 years ago from a firm that designed industrial power systems for hospitals and data centers. 34 years, and when I walked out the door, they gave me a crystal clock and a card that most people signed without reading. I drove home, set the clock on the mantel, and stood in the kitchen for 20 minutes, not knowing what to do with my hands. My wife, Sandra, had been retired for 3 years already. She filled her days with her book club, her garden, her phone calls with our daughter. We had a rhythm, the kind that settles in slowly when the loud part of life finally quiets down. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. The thing that started everything arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March, about 6 weeks after my mother passed away. My mother was 91. She had lived in the same house in Macon for 57 years, a yellow 2-story with a magnolia tree in the front yard that my father planted the year I was born. When she died, that house sold for considerably more than anyone expected. The market had shifted. A developer wanted the land. Between the sale and her savings account and the small life insurance policy she had kept current since 1978, there was a meaningful amount of money that came to me as the only surviving child. I'm not going to say the number. What matters is that it was enough to be noticed. My son-in-law Derek noticed. Derek is 39. He married my daughter, Keisha, 7 years ago. He's not a bad person, or at least I never thought he was. He's the kind of man who always has a plan, always has a pitch, always sees angles. He works in commercial real estate, which means he has learned to talk about money the way other people talk about weather, casually, constantly, like it's the only subject worth discussing. After my mother's funeral, Derek was attentive in a way he hadn't been before. He called more. He stopped by more. He asked thoughtful questions about how I was adjusting to retirement, about whether Sandra and I had updated our estate documents, about whether I had a financial advisor I trusted. I thought it was grief making him considerate. It was something else entirely. The package arrived on a Thursday. A smart home security hub, the kind that connects to your Wi-Fi and lets you monitor cameras around the house from your phone. High-end brand. Solid packaging. A card in Derek's handwriting said, "Dad, with everything you've been through, I want you to feel safe. Set this up and I'll sleep better knowing you two are protected. Love, Derek and Keisha." Sandra held the card and said it was the sweetest thing. I agreed with her. I put the hub on the kitchen counter and spent 2 hours connecting it to our network, mounting the small camera on the front porch and downloading the app. It worked perfectly. I could see the driveway from my phone. I sent Derek a text that said thank you. He responded immediately with a thumbs up. I wore the satisfaction of that small exchange for a few days. It felt like progress in a relationship that had always been cordial but never quite warm. Derek and I existed politely around each other, the way two careful men do when they both love the same woman in different ways. This felt like something shifting. Something real. I was wrong about that too. My friend Calvin has been in my life since 1987. We worked together at the same engineering firm for 11 years before he pivoted into network security consulting. Calvin is the kind of quiet that makes people underestimate him, which is exactly why he's good at his job. He's seen things people don't talk about in polite company. He notices details the way some people notice weather. It's automatic for him. He came over on a Saturday about 3 weeks after I installed the hub. We were in the kitchen drinking coffee, and he glanced at the device on the counter the way you glance at something that doesn't quite fit the room. He didn't say anything at first. He picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. Then he picked it up again. "Marcus," he said, "who gave you this?" "My son-in-law," I said. "After my mother died. A gift." Calvin didn't respond right away. He pulled out his phone and spent a few minutes that felt much longer than they were. Then he looked at me across the counter with an expression I had seen exactly once before, in 2009, when he called to tell me a mutual friend had died suddenly. "You need to look at the network traffic this thing is generating," he said. I almost told him he was overreacting. I almost laughed it off the way you do when someone who works in security starts seeing threats in everything. But I had been in engineering long enough to know that the man who says, "Don't worry about that noise," is usually the one who ends up standing in a flooded basement. So I didn't laugh. We connected his laptop to my router and spent 90 minutes looking at logs. What we found was not what a standard security hub does. The device was making outbound connections on a schedule, roughly every 12 minutes, pushing small packets of data to an external server address that had no affiliation with the manufacturer. The camera was active in intervals that didn't match when I had triggered it from my phone, and the hub's microphone, which the manufacturer described as being used only for voice command activation, had a pattern of extended activation that didn't align with any commands I had given. "Somebody built a back door into this unit," Calvin said. "It's not factory stock. Someone modified it." I sat down at the kitchen table because I needed to sit down. "Who has access to your Wi-Fi password?" he asked. Derek had helped me reset the router 2 months ago before the hub arrived. He had my network password. "Who knows your daily schedule?" Calvin asked. Derek knew I walked every morning at 7. Derek knew Sandra left for her book club on Tuesday mornings. Derek knew that I had phone calls with my financial advisor, a man named Ron, every other Thursday. Calvin looked at me steady and said, "Marcus, somebody has been listening to your house." That sentence did something specific to me. Not panic, not anger, not yet. It was more like the feeling when a reading on an instrument doesn't match what it should be, and you know the fault is real, you just don't know yet how far back it runs. I didn't call Keisha. I didn't call Derek. I drove to the DeKalb County Police Department the next morning, a Monday, during what would have been my old commute time, force of habit. The waiting room smelled like industrial cleaner. A detective named Odom came out after 40 minutes. He was thorough and careful, and he took what Calvin had documented seriously. He brought in the second officer with a technology background. They kept the hub for analysis and told me not to confront anyone. "Don't let on that, you know," Odom said. "Act like nothing has changed." I drove back to the house and sat in the driveway for a while. Sandra was in the garden when I came inside. She called through the window asking if I wanted lunch. I said yes. I sat at the kitchen counter where the hub used to be, in the empty rectangle of dust it had left, and I tried to think clearly. I thought about the conversations that had happened in that kitchen over the last 3 weeks. I thought about what I had said to Ron on the phone about my mother's estate. I thought about the evening I told Sandra I was thinking about transferring a portion of the inheritance into a separate investment account, one in my name only, to keep things organized. I thought about how 2 days after that conversation, Derek had mentioned casually at dinner that it might be worth considering a joint family trust for tax purposes. I thought about the morning I mentioned to Sandra that I'd been having some dizzy spells when I stood up too fast. My blood pressure, probably. Nothing alarming. I thought about how Derek, at that same dinner, had asked me twice whether I was keeping up with my doctor's appointments and whether I needed help managing anything. The word managing sat in my chest like a swallowed piece of ice. Sandra came inside and set a bowl of soup in front of me, and I ate it without tasting it. That evening, after she went to bed, I went down to my home office The room Sandra calls my museum because it's full of old project manuals and equipment I probably don't need anymore. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one with the warranty cards and instruction manuals going back to 1995. In the back, pushed behind a folder of old tax returns, was something that did not belong to me. A manila folder, clean and flat like it had been placed there deliberately and recently. I would have had no reason to open that drawer in months. Inside were printed documents. I recognized the language immediately because I had seen it during my mother's final years when we had needed to navigate her affairs. Power of attorney templates partially filled out. My name in the grantor line, Derek's name in the agent line, notes in Derek's handwriting in the margins, date of last physical, memory concerns discussed with wife, expressed confusion, Ray estate management, consider capacity evaluation. I read the words capacity evaluation 3 times. I sat on the floor of my office with my back against the filing cabinet, and I held those papers and I understood what I was looking at with the same cold clarity I would use to diagnose a failed system. Derek was not trying to help me protect my assets. He was building a case, a quiet, documented, deniable case that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The surveillance wasn't about security, it was about evidence gathering. Every time I mentioned a dizzy spell, every time I said I was tired, every time I expressed any uncertainty about financial decisions, it was going into a file that was designed to replace me with his signature. I put the folder back exactly as I found it. I turned off the office light and went upstairs and lay in the dark next to Sandra and listened to her breathing until 4 in the morning. The next day I called Calvin. I told him about the folder. He didn't say I told you so, which is one of the things I respect most about him. He asked me one question. Does your daughter know? I didn't have an answer. Keisha is 36. She and I have always been close in the particular way a father and daughter can be close without saying much. A shared understanding, a shorthand, the kind of bond that gets built over decades of small, ordinary things. She calls me every Sunday. She sends me articles about things she knows I'm interested in. When my mother was sick, she drove to Macon without being asked. I couldn't square what I was looking at with the woman I had raised. But I also could not rule it out. Not yet. I had learned in 34 years of engineering that the most painful faults are the ones you keep assigning to external causes because you don't want to open the panel that's closest to you. I did what Detective Odom had told me to do. I acted normal. This was the hardest technical challenge of my entire life. Derek called that Wednesday. Casual, warm, asking how I was sleeping, whether I'd looked into any estate planning options, whether the security system was still working well. I said everything was fine. I said I'd been thinking about meeting with a new financial advisor, someone a little more conservative, someone Keisha and I could both feel comfortable with going forward. I heard the slight change in his breathing on the other end of the line. Just a fraction, the way an instrument wavers when conditions shift. Good idea, he said. That makes a lot of sense. I said I might need some help gathering my documents, that my filing system wasn't as organized as it used to be. He offered immediately, without a pause. I can come over Saturday and we can go through everything together. Just tell me what you need. I said that sounded great. Then I called Calvin. What Calvin set up in my office over the next 2 days was elegant in the way that good engineering is always elegant. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would be visible to someone who didn't know to look. The security camera that Odom's team had returned to me, now documented and logged, was back in its position. A small audio recorder, the kind journalists use, was placed inside an old binder on my desk shelf. My laptop was angled so that its camera faced the room naturally, the way a laptop on a desk always faces. Calvin connected everything to a separate encrypted cloud account that Derek had no access to. Saturday morning, Derek arrived at 9 with coffee and that particular smile of his that is warm and businesslike at the same time. Sandra was out. Book club. I had made sure of that. We sat in my office and I let him lead. I played the role, not dishonestly, but carefully. I said I was overwhelmed by all the paperwork from my mother's estate. I said I wasn't sure which accounts needed updating. I said I'd been having more of those dizzy spells. I watched his face the entire time. His pen moved just slightly faster every time I said something that fit the picture he was building. He mentioned the word trust 3 times. Not trust as in confidence in a person. Trust as in a legal financial structure. He mentioned that some families found it helpful to have a designated family member serve as a managing trustee, especially when the primary account holder had health concerns. He said this in the tone of a man presenting a reasonable solution to a reasonable problem, the tone of a person who has rehearsed something enough times that it sounds spontaneous. I asked him if he had any documents he'd been looking at, anything that might help me understand my options. He paused for just a moment, then reached into the leather bag he had brought and produced a folder. Inside were documents that were not the same templates I had found in my filing cabinet. These were cleaner, more complete. A power of attorney instrument with specific financial provisions, a form requesting a voluntary capacity evaluation, pre-filled with my name and date of birth, a letter addressed to my financial advisor, Ron, introducing Derek as my authorized representative for account inquiries, signed by Derek, and leaving a blank line for my signature. He set them on the desk between us the way a careful man sets down something he wants to appear casual about. I looked at the papers. I looked at him. I picked up the power of attorney form and read it slowly, the way I would read any document I was actually considering. Then I set it down and said, "Derek, who filed these?" He said he had put them together himself, with some help from a real estate attorney he knew. "Just a starting point," he said. "Nothing binding until you're comfortable." I said, "Has Keisha seen these?" There was a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds too long. "She knows I've been trying to help you get organized," he said. That wasn't what I asked. I asked if she had seen the specific documents on the desk in front of me. He said he hadn't wanted to worry her with the details. He said he was trying to take the pressure off her by handling the administrative side. He said he cared about our family's security. I nodded. I said I needed a few days to review everything and that I'd be in touch. After he left, I sat in the office for a long time. Through the window, I could see my neighbor's oak tree, the same tree I had watched from this window for 14 years. At some point, Sandra came home and called my name from the front hall. I told her I was in the office. She came in, looked at the papers on the desk, and asked what all that was. "Derek brought some estate planning documents," I said. She looked at them the way you look at something in a language you don't quite read. "He's been so helpful lately," she said. I picked up the papers and put them back in his folder. "Yeah," I said, "he has." I called Detective Odom the next morning and sent him the recordings from Saturday. He listened that day and called me back by 4 in the afternoon. His voice had changed. "This is no longer just a surveillance situation," he said. "What he brought over and what he said constitutes attempted financial fraud. The pre-signed letter to your financial advisor alone is a problem. Combined with the surveillance device, we have a pattern. He told me to contact my financial advisor directly and alert him. He told me to call an attorney before the end of the week. He told me not to sign anything and not to give Derek any indication that the situation had changed. I called Ron first. Ron had been my financial advisor for 11 years. He was quiet while I explained what had happened. The kind of quiet that means someone is recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Then he said he needed to tell me something. About 3 weeks earlier, a man who identified himself as my son-in-law had called the office asking general questions about my account, referencing some specific figures that he should not have had access to. Ron's assistant had not provided any information but had noted the call. Ron had not mentioned it to me because he hadn't wanted to alarm me without more information. Now he had more information. I asked him to document that call and send me everything in writing. 2 days later, Keisha called me on a Sunday, as she always does, same as she always has, and we talked about her week, about a restaurant she had tried, about a book she was reading. I listened to her voice for patterns the way I used to listen to machinery. What I heard was normal. I heard my daughter. I did not hear a woman who knew what her husband had been doing. I made a decision then that scared me more than anything else in this story. I decided to tell her, not everything at once, not with anger. I called her back an hour later and asked if she could come over that week, just the two of us. Just to talk. She said, of course. She said she'd come Thursday. Thursday came gray and cold for Georgia and April. Keisha arrived at noon and we sat in the kitchen, which is where we always sit, where we've sat for every important conversation of her life. I put coffee in front of her. I set Calvin's documented network analysis on the table. I set Detective Odom's case number on a notepad beside it. I set the photos I had taken of the documents from my filing cabinet, the ones in Derek's handwriting next to that. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let her read. She read slowly. Her face went through several things, none of them easy to watch. She stopped at the page with the margin notes. She read capacity evaluation twice. She looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on my daughter's face since she was 7 years old and had broken a window and could not decide whether to lie or tell the truth. She said, "I didn't know about this." I said, "I believe you." She said it again, louder. "I didn't know about any of this, Dad." I said, "I know, baby. That's why I called you first." She cried then, the quiet kind of crying that doesn't ask for anything, just happens, because there is no other honest response to the moment you realize the person sleeping next to you has been conducting a separate agenda inside your own marriage. She asked me what I needed her to do. I told her. The meeting happened the following Tuesday. It was not a conference room at a bank. It was my living room, which felt more appropriate. Present were Detective Odom, Calvin, Ron, my attorney Barbara Muse, who had been in estate law for 27 years and had seen variations of this situation more times than she liked to count, and Derek. Sandra sat on the couch beside me. Keisha sat across the room near the window. She had not told Derek why they were coming. She had only said that her parents needed to speak with them both. Derek walked in, looking the way he always looks. Composed. Ready. That particular commercial real estate confidence he carries everywhere like a briefcase. He shook hands with Ron and nodded at Calvin, two men he had met before. He looked briefly at Barbara Muse and his composure adjusted, just a degree, the way temperature changes in a room when a window opens. Barbara Muse does not waste time. She set the folder on the coffee table and said, "We're here today to address a pattern of activity that has put Marcus at significant legal and financial risk." Derek looked at me. Then he looked at Keisha. Keisha looked at the window. Odom walked through the surveillance device, the outbound network traffic, the server logs, the documented activation patterns during private conversations. Derek's face did something interesting then. It didn't fall apart. It reassembled. Like a man who has run contingencies and is now selecting among them. He said the hub was a standard product. He said he didn't know anything about any modifications. He said he bought it online, and if something was wrong with it, that was the manufacturer's issue. Barbara Muse set the margin-noted documents on the table. The power of attorney templates, the capacity evaluation form, the letter to Ron with the blank signature line. "Derek," she said, "this is your handwriting." He looked at the papers for a long time. "I was trying to help," he said finally. "Marcus has been struggling since his mother died. Sandra was worried. I was trying to make sure their affairs were in order." Sandra said quietly, "I never told you I was worried." The room held that sentence for a moment. Calvin opened his laptop and turned it toward the room. The recording from Saturday. Derek's voice explaining the managing trustee arrangement. Derek's voice saying he hadn't wanted to worry Keisha with the details. Derek's voice recommending a voluntary capacity evaluation for a 63-year-old man who had worked complex engineering problems for 3.5 decades. Derek started to stand. Odom said, "I'd like you to stay seated, please." Derek sat back down. "There are two things I want to tell you about what happened next, because both of them matter. The first is the practical part. Barbara Muse had filed a fraud complaint with the state bar regarding Derek's attorney contact, who was a real estate attorney operating outside his license area in drafting those documents. Detective Odom had enough to refer the case for criminal investigation of unauthorized surveillance. Ron had flagged the incoming call to his compliance officer. A civil suit for attempted financial fraud was already drafted and could be filed within 30 days if Derek did not cease all contact with any of my financial institutions and remove himself permanently from any document that referenced my estate. Derek left without handcuffs, but not without consequences. The walls had already been built. He just hadn't known it. The second thing is harder to talk about, and it matters more. My daughter stayed. Not in her marriage, at least not immediately, not in the way that looks simple from the outside. But she stayed in my corner, in my house, in the kitchen, with her coffee on the table between us the way it had always been. She said she needed time to understand how she had missed it. I told her that people miss the things they don't want to find. That's not a character flaw. That's how trust works. You extend it because that's what love requires, and sometimes that extension gets used against you. Sandra was quiet for a long time after that day. A particular kind of quiet that isn't cold, just processing. She found a way back to me in pieces, over dinners and Sunday mornings and the small, ordinary maintenance of a long life together. She apologized twice, and I told her both times that she had nothing to apologize for. What she had was the same thing I had, a belief that a person who appeared to care actually cared. That's not a mistake. That's a starting point, and sometimes starting points get exploited. I removed the security hub from the house naturally. I went back to the deadbolt and the motion light on the driveway in my own eyes. I updated every password connected to every financial account. I met with Barbara Muse and formalized the documents I should have had current for years. A will, a power of attorney designating Sandra, a healthcare directive that named Keisha, things I'd been meaning to do and had simply not done because there is always something else pressing when you assume the future will wait. Calvin came over a few weeks after everything settled. We sat on the back porch, the one that still leans slightly, and drank cold, sweet tea in the April warmth. He said he was glad I'd let him look at the device. I said I almost told him he was overreacting. He said, "I know. You almost did." I could tell. I said, "I could tell." I said, "How'd you know I didn't?" He said, "Because you're an engineer. You don't dismiss readings." I thought about that for a while. I spent 34 years building systems designed to deliver power reliably and fail safely. What that work taught me, the real lesson underneath all the technical knowledge, is that the most dangerous failure mode isn't catastrophic collapse. It's the slow, quiet degradation that happens over time, in conditions that seem normal, in components you check less often because they've always been fine. People work the same way. Relationships degrade slowly and quietly when the wrong pressure is applied in the right places. A little confusion manufactured here. A little dependency encouraged there, a little documentation built up around a version of you that isn't true but is convenient for someone else's plan. You don't notice it until someone you trust pulls up the network log and shows you what's actually moving through the lines. I'm not telling you this story because I want sympathy. I have what I need. My house still needs a new roof, the porch still leans, and the magnolia tree in my mother's old yard in Macon is someone else's now. None of that is what I think about. I think about how easy it would have been to sign those papers on a Saturday morning over Derek's good coffee. How natural it would have felt to hand something over to someone who had built an entire careful architecture of helpfulness around me. How thoroughly I could have disappeared from my own life without a single raised voice or slammed door. If you're listening to this and you have parents who are aging, or if you are someone aging yourself, I want you to hear this plainly. Kindness that arrives suddenly. Attention that focuses unusually on your finances and your health and your capacity. Offers to help that escalate quickly toward legal authority. These are not always what they appear. Sometimes they are. Sometimes the people who love you genuinely want to help. But the difference between genuine help and something else is simple. Genuine help empowers you. The other kind quietly removes you from the equation. Trust your instincts when a gift doesn't feel right. Ask questions when someone knows things they shouldn't know. Get your documents in order while your hands are steady and your mind is clear, not because someone is pushing you toward it, but because it's yours to do on your own terms. Keep one person in your life who will look at the thing turning over in his hands and tell you the truth about what he sees. And if someone loves you, if they truly love you, they will never need to do it in secret. I'm Marcus, and that's my story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the situations that nearly swallow us whole survive only as long as we keep them to ourselves. Don't forget to subscribe to Voices of Uncle Walter, and thank you for spending this time with me today.